Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. As you know, we are right in the middle of a discussion about policymaking and bureaucracy. We will address that today and continue that discussion, but we're going to begin by doing kind of like a writing workshop where we take a look at the guidelines in the prompt for the theoretical and empirical critique, and then take a look at a strategy for approaching the paper, and then I'll give you an example outline basically detailing how I would do the assignment if I were to complete the assignment. The objective today is to give you a foundation for brainstorming and writing your own paper, and so that you go into this with clear guidelines, and so you know what you're doing and you know what to look for and how to write the paper. Now, I'll tell you up front that I'm going to move the deadline back a week. We have exceptional circumstances, and it's come to my attention that because midterms have been scattered from week to week for many students, it's been very difficult to have adequate time to write the paper. I'm sensitive to that, and I want to accommodate you as best as possible. Now, that being said, I think that you'll do better work if you're given an opportunity to have a little bit more time, and if we go over some of the guidelines in class together. So this is an opportunity for you both to ask questions, but also to do some brainstorming and think about how you'll approach this. I've already heard from many of you who have questions, and I've talked with some of you about how you're approaching the assignment, but I think that this is a chance for us to really learn a great deal and to get off on the right path going forward. So before we continue with our discussion of the bureaucracy and policy and implementation, we'll sort of take a detour and discuss those examples and those guidelines that I wanted to give you. And so we are recording the lecture as always, and for your information, the lectures and the slides have been updated and are all available online and through YouTube, and the links available on CAT courses have been updated as well. And so please use that material as you write your papers, but please also refer back to this lecture and these slides, as they'll be useful too. So let's go ahead and get started with what I have in mind for today. So we're going to be doing a writing workshop, and I like to do these in my classes because they are useful exercises, both in terms of clarifying guidelines, but also giving you an example that maybe you can model your paper after. The example I give you will contain all the parts that your paper will need to include, and the example will also kind of explain those different parts as well. And what I've done is I've even gone down to the paragraph level to kind of help you to see how you might structure your paper as an academic paper with an intro, a body, and a conclusion. Now, much of this might be review for some of you, but I still think that we have a lot to learn, and we can really think carefully about how to structure our papers, how to write strong academic papers, how to make arguments, how to use evidence, how to engage the reading, and so on and so forth. So this workshop will consist of really three components. First, we're going to discuss the assignment. I'll talk about the guidelines, and then I'll give you an example outline. And as I said before, this is an example of how I would approach the assignment and what I would do if I were in your shoes. Now, the example I give you is an outline that no student can reproduce in their own paper. This is an example that I've given you to show you what a model might look like, but you need to consider and generate your own ideas. And so I want you to learn from this example, but don't reproduce the example. Original thought is an important value here at UC Merced and elsewhere, and I want you to be thinking creatively and in terms of your insights. So learn from this model and this outline that I give you, but don't consciously or subconsciously fall into sort of duplicating some of the ideas yourself. Secondly, we'll brainstorm and think about what ideas you have and maybe why you've considered certain countries that you might look at. And then finally, we'll engage in a class discussion where we pan out a little bit and talk individually and maybe as a group about some of our ideas and the way we might approach the paper. So the assignment prompt reads like this, and this is the same prompt that has been in the syllabus since day one. The due date originally was October 22nd. That would be Thursday of this week, but I've moved the deadline back to October 29th, and I'm giving you one more week. But I want to reiterate that the syllabus has contained this same language since day one, and so the assignment itself is not new. The assignment has been available to you from the start. That assignment reads like this. In a short paper of 1,000 words, that's roughly 4 double-spaced pages, you will offer a theoretical and empirical critique of one of the main authors on the syllabus. Specifically, you will seek out evidence from a foreign country and use it to critique the theoretical argument in one of the readings labeled Theory and Evidence on the syllabus. Then you must support an alternative explanation of the phenomenon, which the original author's argument purports to explain. Now, in other words, you're selecting a reading from the course schedule that's labeled Theory and Evidence on that reading list, and then you're seeking out evidence from one foreign country that you can then use to critique that theoretical argument, to sort of challenge or identify the limitations of that theoretical argument. Really, more directly, to falsify that theoretical argument. Remember that hypotheses must be falsifiable, and to falsify a hypothesis is to present evidence that refutes the expectations of that hypothesis. So your critique must do 3 things. First, you must use empirical evidence from a country other than the US and other than your country of origin. Now, the reason for this is because this course is designed to bring you to contemplate systems which are not familiar to you. And as I said from day one, comparative politics is a lot like traveling. We can only begin to know Paris if we leave Paris and see London, and vice versa. We need to step out of our comfort zone and leave our doorstep in order to be able to contemplate those systems which are different and unique and that we don't know well. And if that means leaving the United States, if you're a US citizen or you were born here, then that means leaving the US and studying some other country. If your country of origin is outside of the United States, it means not studying the US and not studying that country of origin. And so what that means then is that we're going to be focusing then on countries that are foreign to us by definition. Now, the evidence that you obtain, that you seek out from this foreign country, you will then use in opposition to the theoretical argument in a reading that's labeled Theory and Evidence on the syllabus. Now, the reading list on the syllabus categorizes the readings according to whether they fall under Theory and Evidence, conceptualization, etc. The vast majority of the readings fall under Theory and Evidence because they introduce a theory and they introduce supporting evidence for that theory. You want to select one of those. Now, at this stage, you might have many questions, and this might be very abstract, but give me a moment and I'll give you an example where we can begin to look piece by piece at how this might work in practice. Now, once you have your empirical evidence that you have gathered sort of in opposition to this theoretical argument that you're honing in on, you want to use critical argumentation to suggest where the theoretical argument in the reading you have chosen has limitations. So this is where you use that evidence to explain the limits of that original theoretical argument. Where does that theoretical argument fall short relative to this evidence? How does this evidence show that that theoretical argument is limited or can be falsified? You want to use the empirical evidence that you obtained in step 1 to offer this critique. And then thirdly, once you have gathered empirical evidence and used critical argumentation, you want to generate a new hypothesis. That is to say, you want to create a new argument or a new theoretical argument based on the evidence that you are providing. This is your new explanation of the outcome that that argument in that article you selected purports to explain. You're providing an alternative explanation of what that original article purports to explain. And you're doing so by gathering evidence that helps to falsify or critique that original theoretical argument. So let me give you an example. This is what I would do if I was a student in this class in writing this paper. I, first of all, would seek evidence from Ghana, which is a West African country. It's a parliamentary democracy with a colonial history. It's a former British colony. And I would use this empirical evidence to critique Herbst's theoretical argument that civil war explains state weakness in African states. Now, specifically, what I would point out is that Ghana, the most peaceful state in West Africa, has a limited history of civil conflict and yet is still a weak state. Now, think about that for a moment. Herbst argues that civil war causes state weakness in Africa. One way of critiquing that is pointing to a weak state in Africa that did not experience civil war. This is what I've chosen to do in this case. And so in the second step of my analysis, I explain that the empirical evidence from Ghana suggests that African states may remain weak even in the absence of civil war. If not civil war, like Herbst says, what else explains state weakness in Ghana? Because civil war cannot explain state weakness in Ghana because there's a relative absence of civil war and conflict in Ghana. It's a relatively peaceful country that nevertheless remains a relatively weak state. So if not civil war, what explains state weakness in Ghana? This is my explanation of how the empirical evidence helps to falsify Herbst's theoretical argument. Now, thirdly, I generate an alternative hypothesis. Specifically, I hypothesize that democracy, interestingly, explains continued state weakness in Ghana. And my theoretical reasoning for this is as follows. Democratic politics, ironically, has resulted in policy backtracking around election time, as well as delayed installed public sector reforms. Now, these reforms would have strengthened state institutions. And so you see how I'm identifying a country that falsifies Herbst's argument, and then I'm making an original argument that can help to explain that deviant case, or that case that doesn't fit with Herbst's argument. And my new alternative explanation focuses on democratic politics. Now, it turns out that Ghana is a robust democracy. It's a parliamentary democracy. It's one of the strongest ones in all of Africa, which is interesting considering that it's a weak state and a strong democracy. But what I'm arguing is that paradoxically, democratic politics has actually contributed to this continued state weakness, or the absence of state strengthening, specifically because it has permitted certain interest groups to enter into politics and to contribute to a lot of backtracking around election time by slowing down the rate of policy change or stalling or reversing policies, and also by delaying and stalling public sector reforms that otherwise would have gone forward and helped to strengthen key state institutions. These are the key components of my critique. Now, given that I have this outline, I've got a country in Ghana that deviates from the expectations that come from Herbst's argument. It falsifies Herbst. And then I have my alternative explanation. How am I going to write my paper? Well, I would outline and write the paper in the following way. First, I would have a short introduction of one paragraph and about 4 to 5 sentences total. I would introduce the research question. I would identify the importance of the question. And then I would have a 1-sentence thesis statement that concisely summarizes the argument of the paper. I would have about 5 or 6 body paragraphs. The first one would summarize the chosen article's theoretical argument. The second and third paragraphs would provide the disproving evidence from Ghana. The fourth and the fifth paragraphs would explain how that evidence helps to disprove that original theoretical argument from Herbst. And then paragraphs 5 and 6 would offer my alternative hypothesis. Now the conclusion would be another 1 paragraph, 4 to 5 sentence paragraph. Very short, very concise. I would briefly restate the thesis statement. I wouldn't duplicate the same language necessarily. I would say it a little bit differently, but I would restate the argument, and then I would conclude by identifying 2 or 3 implications of the analysis. This is a concise and straightforward way of writing an academic article, and specifically one in political science and in comparative politics. This is a formula that you can use for this paper. Let me go ahead and show you what that means for me in my example and what my paper would look like based upon these different components of the paper. So first, my introduction would begin by introducing the research question. And that question is, what causes state weakness? Or why are some states weak while others are strong? Now, the importance of this question is relatively clear. We know already that weak states struggle to perform essential security and development functions. They struggle to mobilize and kind of centralize the resources that are necessary for key investments in social and economic sectors. They struggle to perform and pursue specific political and economic objectives. These are all things that I could say, right? This is the importance of the question. My one sentence thesis statement would go as follows. And this is a model that you could use as well. You could model your thesis statement after this thesis. My thesis is, evidence from Ghana suggests that democracy, not civil war, as Herbst argues, may cause state weakness. Now notice that that thesis statement contains all 3 components of my paper. It contains the evidence from Ghana. It contains the way in which that evidence disproves an existing argument in Herbst. And it shows or highlights the role of democracy, my alternative explanation, in explaining state weakness. This is a concise way of summarizing your full argument. All 3 components are present in a single concise statement. Now, the rest of the paper, and specifically the body, is going to unpack these different components. So the first paragraph of the body will summarize Herbst. Now, this is a brief summary, and I say brief because you really don't need more than 4 or 5 sentences, maybe 6 or 7, but you really just need one short paragraph. You don't need 2 or 3. Remember that in virtually all cases, 1 paragraph should be enough to really kind of put a nice pin on it and highlight the key argument. And so I would briefly summarize Herbst's theoretical argument. And remember that that theoretical argument is civil war causes state weakness. Very straightforward. Body paragraphs 2 and 3 would provide my evidence. And first I would describe the chosen country, Ghana, and then I would describe the evidence, the absence of civil war, and yet the continuation of a weak state, the sort of failure of state strengthening. This is a combination of circumstances that, remember, Herbst does not anticipate. He says that states that are weak in Africa are weak because of civil war, or that civil war is the key factor that explains state weakness in Africa. Now, the absence of civil war in Ghana clearly means that Ghana, as a weak state, is at odds with Herbst's expectations. I spend about 2 paragraphs tops providing this evidence. And this means then that I'm describing Ghana and in general, the sort of case as I find it, and then the key evidence from Ghana that I'm going to then use in subsequent paragraphs. Now, the next 2 paragraphs will explain the evidence and explain how and why the evidence disproves Herbst's argument. How is it that the evidence disproves Herbst's argument? Well, it's because, remember, that a weak state in Africa is expected to always have been victim to civil war or internal conflict. In the absence of internal conflict or civil war, the prospects for state strengthening seem much greater. Now, body paragraphs 5 and 6 will offer my alternative hypothesis. So first, I'll devote a paragraph to describing the strength of democratic politics in Ghana. It's a parliamentary democracy that's relatively robust. and that has enjoyed a lot of stability, peaceful transfers of power, competitive, free, fair, and frequent elections, all of those characteristics that we associate with robust democratic politics. But then in the second paragraph of this section, I link democratic politics to state weakness in Ghana. And I argue that paradoxically, democratic politics helps to explain state weakness because of the way in which democratic politics has permitted a role for organized interests who have been able to reverse policies, install or block policy reforms that would have strengthened state institutions. This is my argument. This is my alternative explanation. And what I would probably say further is that this is the starting point for further analysis for those of us who wish to analyze the causes of state weakness, and in particular to analyze causes of state weakness that reside outside of civil war or internal conflict. So in my conclusion, I bring all of this together. I briefly restate my thesis statement. I don't restate the same thing, but what I say is that democratic politics, not civil war, as Herbst argues, may cause state weakness. Evidence from Ghana suggests. I briefly restate that thesis, and then I identify 2 or 3 implications of the analysis. So whereas in the introduction, I identified the importance of the question, in the end, I identify the consequences or the implications of my conclusion, right? My sort of new hypothesis. And so the question here is, for me, if democracy hampers state strengthening, what else must be true? Well, one thing that must be true is that authoritarian politics might contribute to state strengthening if we can also find that there was an absence of civil war, and in general, authoritarian politics worked in the way that it did, or that it did not in Ghana. So that's one implication. But I might also say that international organizations concerned about state building might need to reassess their support for democracy in developing countries or former colonies, places that have circumstances that might affect state building in a variety of different ways. That's a political implication. My first implication was analytical, and it talked about how authoritarian politics might contribute to state strengthening if democracy and democratic politics can undermine it. Now, other questions might arise. Is it always the case that democracy undermines state strengthening? Clearly not, because we can see examples of strong states that are democratic. The next question may therefore be, under what conditions does democratic politics hamper state strengthening? These are all examples of implications or questions that arise as a result of the analysis that I conducted in this paper. And I want you, in a similar way, to think critically and to think analytically and politically about your topic and your evidence in the country that you chose. This paper gives us a number of opportunities, and one of those is to pan out at the end and kind of think about the big picture. And this is what I've done here with the conclusion. Now, many of you have asked about where to get the information and what kind of data we're really interested in here. I need to clarify a few things. When we say data, all we mean is empirical information. It doesn't mean numbers or statistics. It just means empirical information. And that information can be numbers or statistics. Or it can also be qualitative descriptions of the situation in a country. In general, that data or that evidence is just the information that we evaluate to try to assess the hypothesis in the original theoretical argument that we're critiquing. And so by data, we just mean empirical information. We really just mean information. And so where are we going to get this information? And what kinds of sources should you look to? Well, you should really begin with academic sources, journal articles and books mainly. These can be obtained through the databases in the UC Merced library. But really, in my opinion, a better way to obtain them is by logging into the UC Merced VPN from your desktop going to Google Scholar and then searching for the keywords and the topics that relate to your country and your topic. The reason that I think that's better is because by using the VPN, you will link up and connect with all of the articles that are available through the data sets through UC Merced Library, and they will be presented to you in a long list that will go on for pages and pages. And you can use UC links as well as PDF links that again come from the data sets in the UC Merced Library that link up with your browser if you use the VPN. So begin with those journal articles, begin with those books. Now, you may be wary of using print books or may not have access to them because of the circumstances. Sometimes Google Book is a good place to look if there's a book that you want to use that you don't have access to. Another way to get books is to literally just type the title of the book and then type PDF online, and you can often find a scan online of that book. Sometimes Google Scholar will also bring up book PDFs or links to book PDFs. These are all places that you can find this information. But why should you look to these academic sources first? The reason is because case studies done by other scholars will usually contain the information that you need. And the reason is because these questions have been answered in various ways already. It's not to say that the same study has been done. It's just that there's likely someone else out there who has studied democratic politics individually or even alongside state building in Ghana. It's possible that there are articles out there about state building in Ghana, just state building. Articles about Ghana, state building, and democratic politics, both of those topics together or individually would be useful to me because they would contain information that would be useful to me and that I could use to support my argument. Now, I want you to use those kinds of sources, and I want you to use that information, not just because it will contain what you need, but because it's more reliable and it is peer reviewed. You are, after all, a scholar of comparative politics, and we want to begin by using the literature that's already available to us. There's no shame in using information that appears in publications already. In fact, this is where we usually begin because there's sort of agreement amongst us about the value and the reliability, or at least at a very minimum, the peer-reviewed basis of that information. Now, it's possible that you won't be able to find everything that you need in journal articles or books, especially if you're studying something that's relatively recent. Say you're interested in something or an event that has happened in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. It might be that there are fewer books and articles about that. It may be that your country is relatively small and maybe there's less written about that country or that topic. In that case, maybe newspapers are good places to look. Newspapers from the country in question, assuming you can read the language, or maybe you can get an English newspaper from that country, which do often exist in non-English speaking countries. You can also use reputable newspapers of record that have sections devoted to either that country or that region, maybe the New York Times, for instance, or the Economist or something. The point is, you might need to use newspapers if you're not able to find what you need in academic sources. Remember that UC Merced Library contains a lot of data sets that let you search newspapers and let you search a variety of newspapers all at the same time with targeted keywords and dates and etc. And so this is what I think that you should focus on. You should focus on outlining your paper and writing your paper this way, and you should use these kinds of sources. In my opinion, this is a strategy that will be the most useful, and it not only will set you up to address all parts of the prompt, but it will also set you up to really gather useful information and information that will be reliable and detailed and often well written and well organized as well. Now, before we continue and before we spend some time brainstorming individually before we come back together as a class, I want to open it up to you and ask you if you have any questions about the paper or about the assignment. We've discussed a lot. My goal here has been to give you a sort of overview and a strategy that you could use, but I'm sure that many of you still may have questions, and so please ask me now. What about the most recent news? Anna Martha asks. So really, Anna Martha, it depends on what you're studying, right? So if you choose an article that contains a theoretical argument that you can critique from the perspective of something that has taken place in a country very, very recently, then that's fine. That would be great. Um, in which case, you could use newspapers, you could use print sources that are newspaper related or news related, and you might need to use those exclusively if it's a very, very recent event. Uh, but remember that sometimes when we study these things, events might be part of a broader pattern. Events that take place now or recently might be part of a pattern that stretches back many years. And so, what I would encourage all students to do is to think about this in terms of a pattern, patterns that we observe in a given country, not necessarily an isolated event or something that is recent that happened once. And I'm not saying, Anna Martha, that that's what you're suggesting. But if you do use those recent events, what I would encourage you to do is to try to take it back a little bit further and see if there's some broader pattern that emerges as you look at that more recent news. Dorian asks, will the resources be posted on CAT courses? Dorian, what resources? The ones I have shared with you. So like this workshop, like these slides, this material. Is that what you mean? Of course, absolutely. Yeah, I've been a little slow to post things lately, and I apologize about that. But I'm going to be posting this, and I'm going to make sure that I post it today so that you can refer back to it immediately as you write your paper. Ian asks, so we need a source from the country we are looking at? No, you don't necessarily need a source from the country you're looking at. That might be very hard to come by. What I'm saying is, if you find yourself needing newspapers, sometimes newspapers from the country itself can be the most useful if you can read the language, or if they're in English if you can't read the language. But that's not necessary. You don't need to have a newspaper from the country or a source from the country of in question. Really, Ian, the second part of your question is correct. You just need a foreign country for looking at your topic, a foreign country that you can use as kind of a lens for examining that topic. And really, ideally, that topic in that country will provide you a basic starting point as far as case studies that might already exist on the topic and so on. Rady says, for the VPN, I recommend you call the library, download the VPN, and also get an activation code, which is not your school email or username. I struggled with this during summer school. I'm so glad that you said this, Rady. It is true that configuring the VPN is sort of a challenge. It's not that user friendly. It takes a little bit of work. And as Rady's pointing out, you might want to just call the library, download the VPN from the UC Merced site, and then get an activation code that is not your school email or username. And I really would encourage everyone, frankly, to maybe even go into the chat right now and copy and paste Rady's recommendation, because if you don't have the VPN, that VPN is extremely useful for you to have, especially given that we're online and that we're not in person and we can't access physical resources. So I would encourage you to follow Rady's instructions if you don't have the VPN already, and be a little bit patient with it because it's kind of challenging. But that VPN is incredibly important. It gets you access to everything that you ordinarily would be able to access more or less in person. Jackie points out that they may have made it easier. You just need your school email now. You log in with school email as well for further instructions. Thank you very much, Jackie, for sharing that. I would encourage you all to possibly take down both Rady and Jackie's recommendations, just in case you might want multiple ways of doing it. Efren says, with the critique article, can we use numerous articles for the argument, or do we only choose one and stick with it? Efren, are you asking, can you choose multiple articles from the reading list on the syllabus? Is that the question you're asking, Efren?
Yes, to know is like basically is like, can we look at like, well, can we choose like some from like the class and some from like outside sources and like compare them? Like if it's talking about the same thing, is that possible, or do we only have to choose one and then just like give it like evidence to the like or like oppose the author's argument?
So do you mean choose one to critique or
Oh no no. So like let's say like that we chose like the article that we're gonna be critiquing,
yeah,
and with our academic sources or any outside sources, do we only have like my question is, can we use like numerous sources? Like if it's like journal articles or books like relating to like the same topic,
totally.
possible?
Yeah, and it's unlikely that you'll find everything that you need in a single source. And usually we want to do what we call triangulation, which means we sort of bring evidence and information from multiple different sources and we bring it together to piece together a kind of narrative that is more robust because we draw on multiple sources. It's unlikely that you'll find everything that you need in one or two or even three. You might need four or five, but it shouldn't be overwhelming either. You probably shouldn't need to read everything or even that much. To be honest, you'll have to do some research, but you don't need to overdo it. And I think you'll be able to find what you need in a handful of sources. Brady says there is also some video tutorials on how to do research where you can schedule a meeting with one of the attendants and she or he will guide you through regarding the search toolbar in the online library. Yeah, the UC Merced and the UC system at large are excellent when it comes to providing us access to resources and databases. What I would encourage you to do in particular is use those library attendants and support staff to help you to navigate some of the databases for newspapers. Now, I would still encourage you to look for academic articles and books first, and those are going to be more readily obtainable through Google Scholar and databases through the UC Merced Library. But the newspaper databases in the UC system are really, really good. So NewsX, for example, is an excellent example. There are different databases that collate and bring together newspapers from all over the world. And if you target search with dates and topics, it's especially useful. So that does require a little bit of familiarity with those databases, but we have library support staff available to us that can help us become more familiar. And it's also possible for you to spend a little time looking into it. And in my experience, those databases can be navigated pretty easily if you go to the UC Merced Library website and really kind of slow down and just take a moment to look into it. And what I would really encourage you to think about is, first, I want to acknowledge that I'm aware that reading academic sources and even reading newspapers is sometimes very challenging. And reading academic articles for a class in the first place can be challenging. But I want you to think about it differently. You're not necessarily reading the whole article. You're using the article, you're gutting it, you're looking for evidence or information that supports your perspective. That's empirical information, right? It's data. So we're sort of mining these articles in a way. I don't want you to be sort of intimidated, if you are in any way, by using the materials in this way. Think about it like you're on a scavenger hunt and you're kind of looking for what you need and you're just sort of, dispensing with what you don't need. That being said, I think that though it may take some time to kind of become familiar with databases or to use these academic articles in this way, I think you'll find that on the other side, on the other end, you'll find information more quickly once you become familiar than you would if you used other online sources, which are going to be less reliable, less well organized, less detailed, more sporadic, etc. And so try to avoid websites, try to avoid things like message boards or blogs, focus on academic articles and books, and mine those books and articles for the info you need, and just, don't pay attention to the stuff that's not relevant to your argument. That's okay, Jackie. I was a little confused. Okay, so this is great. I think that I sense that we're feeling a little more comfortable with this assignment, and I'm hoping that you feel ready to do this and that you feel as though there's enough time to do this. Um, I get the sense also that some of you have been working on this already, and in that case, you may feel especially well prepared now that we've taken a moment to look at the guidelines and talk about an outline that would work. And I do want to create an opportunity for you to do a little bit of brainstorming yourself. And what I want to do right now is take about 5-10 minutes tops, and I want you to think about what reading you plan to select. And I want you to go to the course reading list on the syllabus and peruse those articles that are categorized as theory and evidence. Think about what speaks to you and what interests you and what article you would like to address. Secondarily, I'd like you to think about what country you plan to look for disproving evidence in. It's possible that you don't know yet what country might disprove that argument. That's okay. That's fine. Maybe you can think about a region that you'd like to look to for potential deviant cases. Again, you need only one case, so don't overdo it. You just need one country that you can use to critique that argument. And then thirdly, I want you to think about, what does your gut tell you explains that deviant case? What is it that's going on that helps to explain why the original theoretical argument doesn't seem to be panning out as expected in that case? What is that third factor that you can point to and use to explain this deviant case? So let's take about 5 or 10 minutes, and I want you to try to address these questions. If you've already begun working on this, great. If not, let's really use this as an opportunity to kind of try to solidify a starting point for the assignment. So it's about 44 after. We'll go until about 9:50, 9:52 or so, okay? And I'm happy to take questions you have through the chat and interact with you that way. But we will get back together here in a minute, and I'll want to maybe give you a chance to make some comments if you want, or reflect on your ideas. Dorian, I just want to point out that Landman, How to Compare Two Countries, is an article about research methods. So it's not categorized as theory and evidence. So it wouldn't be one that you could sort of properly critique as a theoretical argument. Now, the Landman reading is obviously useful because it talks about comparative methods and the logic of those. Those insights can help to inform the way you approach the paper, but you'll need to select a different article than the Landman one. That's very interesting, Stephen. You can think about that. Absolutely. And I can't see any issue with that design. I would think about how you're going to measure state strengthening or state weakness or state strength, and just be clear about those measures. And using the Soviet Union as a case, I think that's fine. Although it sort of was a federation of states, so to speak. I don't see any issue with that. I think that you can do that no problem. So Anna Martha, my question for you is what reading would you select? Would you be selecting the Linz reading in that case? Okay. So just a reminder that the Linz reading doesn't talk about failed states. It's about the sort of ways that presidential systems tend to break down. You could critique that by finding examples of presidential systems that don't break down. That's certainly one way of attacking that article. Caesar says, the reading I want to counter is elections and electoral systems by Leipart, mainly the representation and the disproportionality of the electoral system. One of the countries I want to look into is any of the countries in South America, not including Mexico. I want to demonstrate how representation in the electoral system is very misunderstood, not just representation of the people, but also smaller parties. Okay, Caesar, just focus on one country. One country is enough, and any more than that might kind of dilute the argument a little bit. So you can just focus on some Latin American country that you find helps you to critique the Leipart argument. Okay, Manuel, that's really interesting. You look at Singapore and how the absence of interstate war didn't didn't mean an absence of state strengthening. Interesting. Think about how, in an effort to remain neutral against larger powers, I want you to think more about what the cause of the state strengthening might be in the absence of interstate war. So even if they had a motivation to remain neutral against larger powers, that might not have motivated the state strengthening or caused the state strengthening per se. That might just be the reason for not getting into wars or conflicts. Alejandro says, I think if voting was seen so important, then making it mandatory wouldn't be an issue. The US has low turnout in voting, but Australia has mandatory voting and has around 90% voter turnout. Also, there are other ways people can participate in like protests and things. So Alejandro, what I would encourage you to do is maybe double back and take a look at what Dalton argues. And Dalton's explaining participation in the United States, in talking about some of the reasons that the participation is as low as it is, the reason that Australia might be a difficult case to compare it to is because Australia has compulsory voting, which is not like the United States. The US doesn't have compulsory voting. And so the cases aren't really similar. Um, and maybe the comparison is harder to make because of that. But I want to encourage you to use the Dalton reading and to think about that because this clearly interests you. And I think that you're on the right track. It's just that we want to think carefully about some of the confounding factors and whether the cases come together in a comparative design that is sort of as effective as we want it to be. I agree, Anna Martha, Venezuela is a good example. You can focus on presidentialism. If you find the presidential regime, the presidential system in Venezuela has been durable, it has not given way to breakdowns, and if you can argue that there are reasons for that that Lens doesn't account for, that would be really interesting. Dorian says, okay, that sounds interesting. Nina plans to critique Marx's reading on how state policies provoked and shaped Black protest, and soon forcing abandonment of official discrimination where it had been enacted. Okay, so that certainly is part of the argument in Marx, Nina. But remember that Marx argues that nation formation in states where there's an intra-group conflict requires the sanctioning of racial superiority so as to dilute that intra-group conflict. And so that sanctioning of racial superiority does often incite racial protest, but that racial protest is not really the key component of the argument in Marx. And so I just want you to be thinking carefully about how the argument is made and what would constitute a critique of the core theoretical argument. And I admit this is the hardest part of the assignment above all, sort of accurately kind of summarizing the theoretical argument. But I have no doubt, Nina, that you can still work with that Marx article and say something really interesting. And there's a lot there. And so please continue with that. Jorah says, I will address the reading of Race Making the Nation State. Good. I think, Joris, the only issue is that remember that in that article, Brazil is a case. In Marx's article, Brazil is already a case. And in Brazil, there was no sanctioning of racial superiority because there was no intragroup conflict. Instead, there was an absence of conflict. And for that reason, there was no reason to institute racial superiority because the nation itself was already likely to form. And so I want you to think carefully about whether Brazil can be part of a counter argument when Brazil was part of the argument already. Maybe you can find a case where it was like Brazil, where there was no intragroup conflict, but the state instituted racial superiority anyway. That would be an interesting approach. So, Efren, if you choose to argue that presidentialism offers a more functioning system for governments rather than parliamentary systems, you'll need to use the case that you select to point to some circumstance or factor that Lenz did not account for. Okay, so if presidentialism is really to be sort of saved, so to speak, what is it about presidentialism in the country that you've chosen that sort of saves it from what Lenz expected to happen? Okay, Joris, that's fine. But remember, though, that though racism is certainly relevant in Brazil, that was, again, part of the sort of background conditions that all the countries shared, right? So that was why Brazil was chosen. I don't know if Marx downplays that. I think Marx is pointing to the fact that even in an environment of considerable racism, the absence of an intragroup conflict within whites in particular meant that there was no need to institute state-sanctioned racial superiority. So I just want you to remain focused on the argument, the theoretical argument, and we can't really deviate from that. Okay, so I'm going to read one more and address one more, and then we'll continue here. Caesar says, I will be selecting political participation, which is Dalton. I will be looking at Germany as my source to contradict the theory and evidence, since Germany has seen rises in voter turnout since the Second World War. I believe that democracies are not bound to collapsing, that democracy does not need to necessarily evolve, yet that its people need to be reformed, reinformed, and stress how important voting and political participation affects day-to-day life. Overall, democracy itself does not fail. It is those who have the civic duty and given the right to vote who seem to not understand the importance of voting. Okay, Caesar, so what you'll want to do is you'll want to really clarify what is the main argument of that Dalton piece. What is the key theoretical argument? And then how can you provide evidence that disproves that? And so what I hear you discussing here is your sort of perspective on democracy and why it collapses or doesn't. But I think that what we need to do is focus more on the causes of participation according to Dalton, and then in turn what you can point to sort of challenge or falsify that argument. And so I think that the lesson here for us is that we need to think mechanically. We need to identify the core theoretical argument. We need to then figure out what evidence would falsify that. Like in my situation, I pointed out that Herbst argues that civil war causes state weakness in Africa. I critique that by pointing to a country where there is a weak state, but where there was never much civil war, and that country is Ghana. And I argue that democratic politics helps to explain state weakness in Ghana despite the absence of civil war. So that is an example of how I'm working through the sort of mechanics of the argument and pointing to an example that doesn't fit the mold. And so we want to stick to that as closely as we can, and that will discipline the way that we assess these articles and assess the evidence. So we've done a really good job already discussing the plan that you have in the reading that you choose in the process, and what kind of evidence you'll look for. And you've also talked at length about the countries that you might look at. And what I want to encourage you all to do is to be open to the possibility that the country that you're interested in at first might not be the one that you wind up writing about. This is usually an exercise in finding a country that we can use to critique the theory. It might be that our first choice actually supports the theory. In that case, well, we would need to go and look somewhere else and find a country that doesn't fit it as closely. And so be open to the possibility that there might be a kind of search or a kind of process of discovery involved here. Now, as you know, we are smack dab in the middle of a lecture on policymaking and implementation. And this lecture has us discussing the bureaucracy as the key component of the state involved in implementing policies decided on and approved and passed by the key authoritative institutions of the state, the executive and the legislature. Now, the bureaucracy is the key piece of machinery in this equation, as we've emphasized. And the bureaucracy is a part of the state that we can define in the following way. The bureaucracy refers to a rational, rule-bound, and hierarchical form of organizational structure set up to perform administrative tasks. The bureaucracy refers to the administrative machinery of the state. It is that set of parts, or that set of institutions involved in administering the design and the imposition of policies that are produced by the political process. Whereas politics takes place in the legislature and the executive, and whereas politics produces policies, the bureaucracy produces the implementation process and the design process once those policies themselves are selected. Now, bureaucrats are different than those legislators or those executives who wind up in power as a result of being selected by a legislative majority in a parliament or independently elected in a presidential system. Bureaucrats are non-elected state officials or civil servants, and that means that they're there to stay. Whereas legislatures and governments come and go, bureaucrats and civil servants and the agencies that are full of them tend to persist. And the way that we would think about a hard drive persisting. We can change the software of a computer. We can change the browser that we use to navigate the internet. That's kind of like the government of the legislature. We can change that routinely at the next election or as a result of a vote of no confidence if we choose to just kind of spontaneously make changes of that sort. But the hard drive itself is much more difficult to change and tends to persist and will be there much, much longer. The hard drive is like the bureaucrats. The hard drive, the agencies, the bureaucracy, this is the machinery of the state that persists and is there to stay. Now, the bureaucracy, though it is there to stay, and though it often sort of takes a back seat, is incredibly important to the political process because much of politics as a whole actually is characterized by implementation and policy design that takes place after political decisions are made. And so I have a quote here that captures this, and this is by Terry Moe from a 2005 article called Power and Political Institutions. And he wrote, "What kinds of institutions do democracies normally create? Political scientists tend to rivet their attention on the key authoritative institutions, legislative, executive, and judicial, set up by the Constitution, or on the framework of democratic rules themselves. The great bulk of government, however, is composed of bureaucratic agencies. And those bureaucratic agencies are again involved in policy design and implementation after legislatures and executives produce policy decisions themselves. And so the bureaucracy, in addition to being a permanent feature of the state, is also the bulk of the state in that it is much more extensive and more lasting and larger in scope and sophistication than the executive or the legislature, regardless of the importance of the legislature or the executive to the actual policy making process. So the bureaucracy, understood in this way, has really three main functions. And a good example of a bureaucracy is the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, in the United States. There are a variety of different institutions or bureaucratic institutions of the state in the US that are chiefly involved in security and in domestic security in particular, intelligence, etc. The DNI and other bureaucracies like it are involved in carrying out administrative duties, offering policy advice to politicians and leaders, maintaining political stability by creating continuity from government to government, ensuring the delivery of certain services, certain functions, etc. These are all essential to the functioning of a bureaucracy. This is what bureaucracies do. In addition to administering policy design, they often also serve as sources of intelligence or information or expertise for politicians. And in the process, they're also involved in maintaining stability from government to government, precisely because of the sort of continuity in the bureaucracy and the fact that bureaucrats and civil servants tend to be there for the long haul. So the core function of the bureaucracy is to implement or execute law and policy. The vast majority of the world's civil servants are engaged in this kind of responsibility. They're designing and implementing and executing the laws and the policies that are designed that are decided on in the political process itself by the legislature or in the executive. In this regard, they are taking care of activities that take place after decisions have been made. And yet these administrative responsibilities also, however, also involve a lot of discretion on their part. And so one thing I want to stress to you as we continue is that even though they administer the design and execution and implementation of policy, they're not mere functionaries who merely carry out orders. In some cases, they also have an agenda of their own. And in fact, we'll see in a moment that the principal agent issue implies that they always have an agenda of their own. And that the key problem is exerting control over bureaucrats who would prefer to shirk and do their own thing rather than carry out the implementation and design and execution tasks that fall to them as the administrative machinery of the state. And so even though most civil servants are engaged in administrating, they often have an agenda of their own, and they often can have influence of their own. Now, the way that they exert influence often takes the form of policy advice. Top-level civil servants have daily contact with politicians, and they're expected to act as policy advisors and to provide expertise and information. And the policy role of civil servants takes really three different forms. First, they outline policy options available to ministers. These are the different possible choices available to us. They review policy proposals, and they provide information to policymakers. They are a source of expertise, information, and policy options. They provide the sort of range of options and choices available to politicians at any given moment. And they are a source of technical expertise in that they can complement that policy advice with the information and the expertise that they have in their particular area. And then in turn, some of the pros and the cons or the strengths or the weaknesses of different policy proposals, different options available to the ministers and to the president or the prime minister and the government. And so policy advice, in addition to being part of the responsibility, administrative responsibility of bureaucrats, bureaucrats have expertise that politicians don't have. And so the options that they can present to them, they may curate in their favor or present in a way that expands their responsibility or their power or gives them a larger budget or so on. They might review policy proposals in a way that creates a benefit or views their agency favorably. They might provide information to policymakers that leads policymakers to choose a certain option that would empower those bureaucrats or give them an extensive responsibility in implementing some policy, which those bureaucrats would love because bureaucrats tend to enjoy power and enjoy the capacity to create rules and to execute and implement them. The third source or third function of the bureaucracy is political stability. And this again relates to the continuity and the stability within political systems that bureaucracies provide. Governments come and go, the bureaucracy remains. This continuity does have some disadvantages, though. There's little effective public scrutiny or accountability of bureaucracies. They are, in some ways, a black box, undetectable, difficult to discern the activities of. This continuity can also create a bias in favor of conservatism. Bureaucracies tend to be so focused on continuity and sort of the sameness from moment to moment that they can lapse into what we would think of as conservative patterns of policy making and design. And so there's actually a term for this called bureaucratic inertia. Bureaucratic inertia refers to a pattern where the bureaucracy falls into routines and when it enters into contracts far into the future. And this bureaucratic inertia tends to contribute to this bias and this sort of conservatism and this kind of continuity. Now, how much political stability is too much? Well, in some cases, bureaucracies can resist orders and can resist policy changes that might undo or take away some of their responsibilities that they became used to and that they really began to enjoy and derive power and really resources from. In those cases, bureaucracies might be hesitant to make changes, and they might resist change. And so, for example, in Mexico, trade policy reform in the 80s and the 90s often came with a lot of resistance on the part of different economic institutions of the state who didn't want to give up some of the powers that they had gained in conjunction with tariffs that had been imposed on imports in particular. And so this bureaucratic inertia can be problematic because it can stall policy change when decisions have already been made. And this continuity can be overwhelming and can contribute to conservative biases that hold back policy change. Now, we've got virtually no time left, but I'm going to go ahead and finish the lecture. And I'm going to do so because I'm recording this and you can view the rest of the lecture online, and I'm going to post it immediately. Now, the bureaucratic issue of utmost importance is the issue of control and how to control these bureaucrats. I just talked about how bureaucratic inertia and conservatism and bias and resistance to change can sometimes be ingredients in the relationship between the bureaucracy and the executive and the legislature, and that sometimes this conservative bias can hold back change. Relatedly, there's the issue of controlling the bureaucracy. This bureaucracy, bureaucrats and civil servants have important sources of power. In the first place, the strategic position that they have in the policy process that stems from being policy advisors and controlling implementation means that they can shape the implementation of policies in ways that benefit them and maybe preserve some of their responsibilities. And it means that they can sort of shape or filter the policy advice that they give to politicians so as to preserve their responsibilities or their influence or give themselves a sort of leg up, so to speak. This means then that they can influence politics in ways that politicians themselves can't always understand because they have incomplete information. Now, there are also links between the bureaucracy and other organized interests. So, for instance, in the Mexico example I gave you, those economic institutions that resisted trade policy reforms were closely linked to state enterprises that also benefited from tariffs that made importing foreign products more difficult. Those state enterprises had a monopoly on the domestic market and had alliances with the bureaucracy. Those links between the bureaucracy and organized interests in Mexico made it difficult to change trade policies, and it gave the bureaucracy a great deal of power, and it reduced the control that the executive and the legislature had over the bureaucracy. Finally, there's also the issue of status and expertise. These bureaucracies have status and have expertise. They have expertise in information. They also have a very celebrated role in government. And this means then that they themselves can be power brokers who can exert influence and shape politics and shape policy. Now, in this issue or this question of the control of the bureaucracy arises the issue of the principal agent problem. And this is a problem that relates to a conflict in priorities between a political authority, the principal, this can be the executive or the legislature or both, and the bureaucracy, the agent, authorized to act on the political authority's behalf. Now, the agent is the civil servant or the bureaucracy or the agency in question. In the nature of this problem is that the agent may act in a way that is contrary to the best interests of the principal. They face an incentive to shirk, as we call it, and that means to sort of not fulfill their responsibility or to act in a way that is contrary to the interests of the original decision maker, the president of the legislature. And this control of information and implementation creates opportunities for shirking in particular. So we can refer to what we call log rolling between bureaucrats, where they kind of collude or coordinate to slow down implementation or shape implementation. We can refer to mission creep, which refers to when bureaucrats and bureaucracies kind of take more responsibility and kind of shape the implementation and the design of the policy beyond the boundaries and the limits set up by the legislature and the executive. And there's other mischief as well that they can engage in, sometimes engaging in corrupt acts that might benefit them personally at the expense of the public. All of these things relate to issues of control that arise in the context of the principal agent problem. And the key point that I want to make to you is that the bureaucracy may have its own agenda. It's not enough to just view the bureaucracy as a functionary that takes orders. The bureaucracy is a power broker. It is a political actor that may have its own agenda. And what this means in turn is that executives and legislatures need to exert control over the bureaucracy. They need to establish mechanisms for minimizing shirking and making sure that log rolling doesn't take place, that mission creep doesn't take place, and that corruption doesn't fester inside the bureaucracy. And so some of those ways of controlling bureaucrats are as follows. First, creating mechanisms of political accountability. So creating sort of review bodies or anti-corruption bodies or institutions outside of the bureaucracy that are charged with or given the power to review the activities of the bureaucracy. So sometimes these are legislative institutions, sometimes they are executive institutions. But these mechanisms of political accountability can be very important because they can make it more costly for bureaucrats to engage in shirking or other behavior that is contrary to the interests of the key decision makers. You can also politicize the civil service. This is a form of political control. So you put party stalwarts in key positions in the bureaucracy on the premise that because they're part of the political party, they owe allegiance to the government and they therefore face higher costs to shirking or pursuing their own agenda. They're more likely to be sort of subordinate and compliant and to obey because of the political fallout that could arise if they shirk or engage in mission creep or other forms of mischief. And then finally, we can construct counter bureaucracies, that is, bureaucracies that are charged explicitly with checking other bureaucracies. And this is a divide and conquer strategy that really means creating multiple centers of power that can be engaged in the sort of watching over of each other in ways that would help to prevent mission creep and shirking and et cetera. So this does conclude the lecture for today. I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to post this afternoon, and you're free to go. Thank you for being with me today, and I hope that you found the writing workshop useful and that you got something from that. And I hope that you enjoy the additional week that you'll have to write the paper. Good luck, everyone, and I will see you on Thursday.